Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Hope Machine from Asthma UK and the British Lung Foundation. Once again, we're shining the spotlight on some of the world-class research giving real hope to people with lung disease across the UK. Coming up in today's episode, we'll be meeting Dr Nick Hopkinson, whose fascinating research on lung volume reduction has already brought a lot of good news to people living with COPD. We're also going to be chatting to Dr Thomas Brown, who's looking into whether a new device can enable us to diagnose asthma in just a matter of minutes. Nick and Tom will both be taking on our 60-second challenge, where they have a minute on the clock to explain their very brainy research in language so simple a 9-year-old could understand it. We've got our resident 9-year-old on standby, waiting to give her verdict. We really hope you enjoyed today's episode, and don't forget, we are a charity, so we can only support brilliant research like this thanks to people like you. If you feel able and would like to support our research appeal today by making a donation, we'd really appreciate it. And now, let's hand over to Ian Gerald, who's with our first researcher.
Hi Nick, thanks very much for joining us today to talk about your research. Before we start getting into the detail of your research project, I just wanted to ask you a few kind of icebreaker questions so that we can get to know you a little bit better. Firstly, what do you think you would have been if you hadn't been a doctor and a researcher?
Oh gosh, I don't know, lost. I guess I like stories. Everyone thinks they've got a novel in them. Perhaps I like writing, so maybe something like that.
Maybe that's a nice, retirement project. That book is in there somewhere, definitely. What's your favourite place in the world?
I love the beach at White Sands Bay, so near St David's. We go there on holiday a lot. So yep, that's one of my favourites, I suppose.
And can you tell us something about you that not many people know?
I don't know. I've met the Dalai Lama. It's not a great anecdote. I mean, I shook his hand and said hello. He said hello. It wasn't. There's not much more to it than that.
Okay, so moving on to your research, can you first of all just tell us a bit about, what is COPD and what's life like for people who are diagnosed with it?
So COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So chronic because it's a condition that persists. Obstructive because people who have a problem moving air in and out of their lungs. So they have airflow obstruction. Pulmonary because it's to do with the lungs, and disease because it's a medical condition. So what it is usually caused by is damage to the lungs from inhaling to noxious materials, mostly tobacco smoke, but also occupational exposures as well can cause it. People with the condition have sort of bronchitis, so damage to the airways. They can have damage to the lung tissue, which is emphysema, problems with the blood vessels in the lung getting damaged as well. So the blood isn't as able to take up oxygen when people breathe. And all of those things together mean that it causes breathlessness, and that can be very, very limiting.
And in terms of sort of like the effects on day-to-day life, does it mean that people have trouble doing their normal activities like walking to the shops or walking up their stairs, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge rate. So it's a progressive condition. So it often starts quite insidiously, slow. People may feel a little bit breathless. They may stop doing the ordinary activities or go more slowly, and often it's a while before the sort of penny drops that there's a real kind of underlying lung problem. But as it progresses, it can become completely disabling. So people with most severe disease can find it difficult to get from room to room in their house, to get out of breath, washing and dressing even.
Okay, so you're looking into a type of treatment for COPD called lung volume reduction surgery, and can you tell us how does that work and how effective is it?
So a healthy lung is like a sort of springy sponge. What happens with emphysema is that breaks down. The lungs become kind of baggy and they don't empty properly, basically. So air gets trapped inside the lungs. So a person can breathe in, but when they try and breathe out, the airways close and there's just air trapped and getting in the way.
Right.
So what lung volume reduction procedures try to do is to get rid of the worst affected bit of the lung, so the healthier part of the lungs can work better and the person can breathe more comfortably. And there's basically two key two main types. One is lung volume reduction surgery, where you have a kind of keyhole operation to remove the worst affected part of the lung. And the other is what's called endobronchial valves. So rather than cutting the bad part of the lung out, the person has a bronchoscopy. So a little fiber optic camera goes down into the lung, and little valves are placed into the airways inside the lungs that actually stop air getting to that worst part of the lung. So rather than it being cut out, it's still inside the chest, but all the air in it gets sort of reabsorbed.
So I guess in a way it's one way or another you're directing airflow to the parts of the lung that are still working well.
Yeah, exactly. So and these treatments can have a really big impact. So they can turn the clock back several years, improve breathlessness. People can walk further, and the evidence is actually that they improve survival in people with severe emphysema. So that they're potentially very, very beneficial.
And can you tell us about the research study that Asthma UK and the British Lung Foundation have recently supported? Can you tell us, like, what were you trying to do? Why was it important? And what do you think it will help us to understand?
Yeah, lung volume reduction surgery has been around for more than 20 years, and valve treatment is a little bit more recent than that. But they're both treatments that are done in a few specialist centres, and most people with COPD never get considered for them. When we've sort of talked to patients about this, one of the things that comes back is this sort of line, I had to fight to get a referral. What we wanted to do was to set up a register to link up all the different centres that were doing it, so that we could kind of identify the centres that were involved, that we could make sure that everybody was selecting people appropriately, and begin to gather data about sort of longer term outcomes by setting up this community, almost this register. When we went to NHS England and said, we think that you should commission lung volume reduction procedures for people with COPD. Part of the argument, apart from just how effective these treatments are individually, was that the system, the health system, will be able to implement them in a way that was responsible and effective. And that was successful, and NHS England has now approved these sorts of procedures for people with COPD. And prior to that, NICE had come out with a very clear recommendation that they should be offered to people too.
In a nutshell, this research has led to real changes in the way that COPD patients are treated, or at least, for those who are likely to benefit, they now have a greater chance of having access to this treatment. This certainly falls into that kind of category of outcomes that will make a difference to people's lives in the kind of more immediate term, I guess, which is great to see. And I think, everyone would be really happy to hear that our charity is supporting that kind of work, not just stuff that's maybe not going to come to fruition for several decades. So now we're going to give you a little bit of a challenge. Can you explain this research study in about 60 seconds, so simply that a child of 9 could understand it?
Probably not. But here goes. In people with lung problems that cause them to get very, very breathless, usually as a consequence of having smoked for a long time. So in people who have that, there are some procedures that you can do, some treatments that help with breathing. One of those is an operation to take out the most damaged bit of the lung, and the other is putting special valves in that block off the worst affected area of the lung, so that the remainder of the lung works better. What we did with this was try to join up all the different centres in the UK that are doing this, or all the different hospitals that are doing these procedures, so we could collect information about who was having them and what the outcomes were, to make sure that the right people were being selected for the procedures, and to make sure that the outcomes that we're getting in sort of real life are the same as in the experiments, the trials that were done originally as part of research.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us today. It's been really great hearing from you, and good luck with your future work.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Ian and Nick, and well done, Nick, for taking on our 60-second challenge. If you're enjoying this video today and you're finding the information helpful, don't forget to give us a like, leave us a comment, and of course, subscribe to our channel. And now, before we head over to our next researcher, here is something I bet you didn't know.
I bet you didn't know that we want everything we do to be driven by the needs of people with lung disease. And the way that we do this is by firstly finding out what's most important to you. And we use this information to create insights which shape our own work and the work of others too. So to give you an example of what this looks like, we work really closely with researchers so that we know the research that's being developed is the most relevant that it can be to patients. And through doing so, we hope that the treatments, the products and the services that researchers develop can add the most value and benefit to the lives of people with lung disease. So we advocate for researchers to take a three-stage approach in their work to involve patients. Firstly, we want researchers to ensure that their research question is based on an unmet need that they've identified among people with lung disease. Secondly, we want researchers to co-create a solution to this unmet need along with people with lung disease, based on what works for them and also what doesn't. And finally, we want researchers to test and iterate the solution so that we can find out if it works for people with lung disease, if they're willing and able to use it. But the only way we can do this and ensure that the work that we do is driven by patient insight is by hearing from you. So please do get in touch, we'd love to hear from you. You can get involved through our survey work, through attending focus groups, or giving feedback. Keep an eye out on social media and email for these opportunities so that we can ensure everything we do continues to be driven by the needs of people with lung disease.
Hi, Tom. Thanks very much for joining us today to talk about your research. First of all, what would you have been if you hadn't been a researcher?
So I think that's a double-fold question. I think the first one, if I hadn't been a researcher, I think I would still have been a doctor, and I'd probably be spending, an equivalent amount of time in clinical practice. Really, still always been fascinated by respiratory medicine.
What's your favourite place in the world?
My favourite place in the world actually is a beach in Wales where I grew up with all my family, and we still go there. And it's so important to have somewhere to relax, take your mind off things. And you have to have a balance in life, and I think that's so important.
Can you also now tell us something that you're either really good at or something that you're really bad at?
Oh, well, I think it's really important to focus on the things that you're not so good at, isn't it? We all talk far too much about things we think we're good at. So what am I really bad at? And my son would say football, because every weekend I take him and watch him play football, and then we play afterwards as I embarrassingly shoot the ball miles away. And I think that's probably something that we're working on together.
Moving on to talking about your research project. So, I mean, on the face of things, your area of interest sounds quite simple. So, it's all about how we can tell whether someone has asthma or not. And as we know, this is a big issue because some people still go for years before they receive a proper diagnosis. And all that time, they've been receiving maybe no treatment or treatment that they should be getting, they haven't been getting. So what is it about asthma that makes it so hard to diagnose?
So that's a really interesting question, and it's a really important question. The difficulty with asthma, it's very much an umbrella term for a whole group of different conditions that present with a similar group of symptoms. And the difficulty with that is twofold. One is that it is very varied, and the other is that it does change so much over time. And also it's about access to those diagnostic tests. So how do you actually confirm somebody has asthma? A lot of the time, there's a big difference between the types of testing somebody might have access to, particularly in primary care. And some of those tests are really difficult to do well. And the other point is that quite often people with asthma, at the time that they have their testing, they might be completely well. So it may be that their tests are all normal. And so what we've ended up with is this acceptance that therefore it's okay just to go with either a trial of treatment or a wait and see option. But that leaves a lot of uncertainty for patients. And often it means that patients are presenting with a crisis such as an acute asthma attack in order for us actually to make that diagnosis, when we know that we have effective treatments, for a lot of these patients that we could start.
I mean, that highlights what a huge challenge this is really. But I know you're testing a device which looks like it could be really helpful in easily working out if someone has asthma or not. And can you tell us a bit more about your research project that Asthma UK and the British Lung Foundation are supporting, and what is it that you're hoping to use this device to actually test?
So the idea of this device is that it's a point of care test, which means that it's something that you do in the surgery. It's something that takes 1 to 3 minutes for a patient to breathe into. But importantly, you don't have to do a forced breath. You breathe what we call tidal breathing, which is gentle breathing in and out. And what the device does, it measures several different things over that time period, and it forms then what we're calling a breath print. So the idea is to have this this overall view of this information that you've gained. And then what we want to do is to use that alongside the other information that we have with asthma, in terms of testing for asthma, to see whether that can enhance our diagnosis of asthma, help us diagnose other conditions, but also importantly for people with asthma, can it help us to identify other specific characteristics of their asthma that might need differences in their treatment. One of the things that we're seeing more and more commonly now is patients who are experiencing breathlessness, but in the absence of underlying asthma. And we call this a breathing pattern problem, where there's a lack of essentially, when people are breathing, it's the way they're breathing that is creating that sensation of breathlessness. And that can be really important to address. But we also very commonly see that alongside asthma, so important to identify it. We can also measure the temperature and the relative humidity of that exhaled breath. And that can give us important information about inflammation as well, potentially. So what we're trying to do is take all of this information and see whether using this alongside these other measures that we already look at, that can help us to diagnose asthma, but also look at the subtype or the different type of asthma a patient may have. And we do already have some evidence to support these. So this isn't something that we've newly dreamt up. This is a device that's very well validated. These are all markers that have got some evidence behind them, but we're trying to put them together, and we're trying to really see whether using this as a combination can help us make that diagnosis of asthma more swiftly so that people can have access to treatment, in a timely way. But also importantly, people who don't have asthma are not then taking treatments they don't need, which can be detrimental in their own right.
I guess it sounds to me like this test will give us more of those pieces of the jigsaw and enable us to put them together better so we can really make that confirmed diagnosis.
Exactly that. It's always likened to an iceberg. At the moment, we measure the things that we can see. So we measure symptoms and we measure some lung function. But hidden underneath that, this enormous iceberg under the sea, is the inflammation, the breath flow dynamics, perhaps some of these other measures that we're now bringing out. And actually, if we could see those and understand those and measure those, that will help us hopefully to diagnose asthma, but also help us to effectively control asthma for our patients.
It sounds great. And, looking at kind of real world impacts, how do you think your research might change things for people who are currently struggling to get asthma diagnosis? So how might this work in the real world?
I think what we'll see over, the next few years is a movement towards community diagnostic, by which I mean in sort of GP surgeries or linked up GP surgeries. But it's also an efficient test. It can be done in a matter of 1 to 3 minutes. It's a very safe test for patients. It's unlikely to be cause them any problems with the more gentle breathing.
Right. And how far into the future do you think we need to go before we actually might start seeing these tests being available to patients?
So really, I genuinely very much hope that within the next, within a 5-year timeframe, we would see this being used widely in clinical practice.
Amazing. So it's possible that in 5 years from now, someone will go to their GP, have this particular test if they're having breathing difficulties or symptoms that might be consistent with asthma, and this test will help us to make a definitive diagnosis and say, yes, you do have asthma, or no, you don't, and even possibly say you have this specific type of asthma, and then we can start treatment straight away in the right way.
That's exactly what we're aiming for, and I think that needs to be the goal for diagnostic testing in asthma. Asthma is a jigsaw, and the reason it's a jigsaw is because it's an umbrella term for various different very similarly presenting but different conditions, and there are also very common mimics of asthma. We need to wait and see what the research shows, and that's the value of this research project. So I have a 9-year-old daughter who often baffles me, so I will do my best, but she's probably far brighter than me and be far better at doing it, but let me have a go. So I think the one of the most important things to say to start with is that asthma isn't just one thing. Different people with asthma have different symptoms and they have different types of asthma. So it's important to know that, because it makes finding asthma quite difficult. And actually what we know is quite a lot of people who think they have asthma don't have asthma, and they might actually be taking treatments for it, like the puffers, and actually they don't need them, and that's really important. But also we do need to make sure that people who do have asthma do have the treatment they need so they get better. At the moment, we've got lots of tests for asthma, but sometimes we still don't know if people have asthma. And so that means, as I've said, sometimes people have treatment when they don't need it, or people don't get the treatment they need, or they're left not knowing, which is really not very nice. So what we need to do is get better at diagnosing asthma. By diagnosing, I mean finding it and telling people with confidence that they do have asthma. And what the work that we want to do is to see if we can do that using a new test. And what that does is it measures quite a few things, and it tries to bring them all together to see whether, by using lots of things, we can tell with a little bit more certainty whether somebody does have asthma or not. And the way that we're doing that is with a breathing test that you can do in the doctors. You breathe into it for up to 3 minutes. But you just breathe gently in and out, and then it looks at your breath and it tells you about your breath and whether you might have asthma. But also it might tell you, if you have asthma and you're not getting better, why that is. So it might be very important, and it may well be that this can be very helpful for doctors and nurses to tell whether people do have asthma or not.
Thanks very much, Tom. It was really great to hear more about your work, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it pans out over the next few years. So good luck from all of us, and thanks again for spending some time with us today.
Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Brown. That's amazing to hear what impact your work could have for people waiting for an asthma diagnosis. And that's all from us on the Hope Machine today. Thank you for joining us. If you would like to support more amazing research projects like the ones you've heard about today, we would really appreciate you making a donation if you can. There's a link on screen to donate to our research appeal right now, and there's also a link in the description below this video. We're really keen to hear what you thought of the show, so please do give us a like, leave us a comment, and of course, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye.